those who are joining online, I just want to encourage you again, if you can, to join us in person. It's a more interactive experience, and you have the ability to participate further in discussion and to be with us and learn. And whether you're online or in person, to please make sure you subscribe to our email list just to see if there's any updates from time to time. And please to remember that the videos are recorded on YouTube in case you missed them or want to review. There were a couple of really important themes that we already delved into in our exploration of the 4 verses that the Haggadah chooses to recount the story of the Exodus. Remember that we are engaged in a study of Midrash. Midrash, just a reminder, is rabbinic expounding or interpretation on verses, words, could be even a letter in the Torah, trying to look at the way the Torah tells the story and understand what is the deeper meaning. The Torah leaves a lot out, doesn't tell the whole story all the time, and sometimes the rabbis will tell the story in their own way, sometimes in many different ways, by looking at the text itself and pointing to comparisons between the words that are used in one section of the Torah and maybe words in another section of the Tanakh. So that's Midrash. Remember from last week, so last week we finished the second of the 4 verses of redemption. The first verse tells the story of how we ended up there in the first place. The second verse tells the story of the gradual descent into slavery. So remember last week we focused on this idea of genocide occurring in stages. What is gradualism? That you don't just make people slaves and commit genocide overnight. It takes a concerted effort to do so. And the Haggadah certainly tells that story about our experience in Egypt. It happened slowly, stage by stage, beginning with falsification, smear campaigns, lies, and eventually subjugating the Jews and the important thing, or the Israelites, and the important thing that the Haggadah says about their subjugation is that it was influenced by the Egyptian obsession with wheat. What is wheat? Wheat is cash. Wheat is money. It was driven by the Egyptian taste and obsession with the accumulation of wealth. That is what the Jews were engaged in. That's what motivated their slavery in the first place. And by the way, there are notes of this all over the Seder. I think it's no accident that wheat, the leavened versus unleavened kind, is the focus of much of our Passover observance. What we do with wheat, how we handle wheat, the message of wheat, and the role that wheat plays in the story, whether it's pointed to in the Haggadah, or whether it's something that we just know based on human history. If you read Yuval Harari's book on the evolution of humanity, I forget what his book is called. Sapiens, right? There's a whole chapter on the cultivation of wheat and the role that it played in human history. And many people don't know this, but wheat originates in the Fertile Crescent, specifically in Egypt, but in the area of the Middle East that we tend to be concerned with, that's where wheat comes from. And it's just it should not be missed, the fact that so much of the Passover observance and story is being told with that in mind. A grain that you can store and can accumulate, that can last a long time and help you navigate through famines, can be a tool for the exploitation of others and the oppression of those who are different, right? We talked about the role that played, according to some scholars, in the Holocaust as well. Limited resources and the hoarding of that in order to favor one class of people over another. We now find ourselves at the third verse of the 4 verses of that are telling the story in the Haggadah. This verse is about redemption, the beginning of redemption, God hearing the cries of the people. So if you open up your Haggadah, you'll find that it begins with Vanitzak el Hashem Elokei Avoteinu. Vanitzak el Hashem Elokei Avoteinu. You can take your time to find that, but it's somewhere it's almost exactly in the middle of the exploration of the 4 verses. We cried out to God and the God of our ancestors. The verse is Deuteronomy 26:17. And now the Midrash is going to pull apart this verse. That's what we're going to focus on today. Right at the beginning, you can see already, we cried out to God, the God of our ancestors. This verse introduces the most profound theological question of the Haggadah, maybe the most profound theological question of all of Judaism. Because right away the verse says, okay, God heard us and took us out of Egypt, right? It misses something very, very important that the Midrash does not miss. What is missing? The question of why God took his time to finally redeem the people, right? The way the story is told is, okay, we were suffering and then God brought us out. But it skips over in these verses the theological question. Why did God allow it to occur in the first place? The Haggadah from the beginning, I should remind you, has a very clear, objective, and almost universally understood answer to that question. Why is it that God allowed people to suffer, or allowed this chosen people, the people of the covenant, to suffer? You know the answer? If we go with everything we've been taught from the beginning, right, it seems pretty clear what the belief was regarding God taking his time to redeem the people, allowing slavery to fester for so long. What's the answer? The answer is it was all in God's plan. That's what the Haggadah says right from the beginning. God knew about this from Abraham. In other words, suffering had some purpose for God. Everything had to happen. God did not create a world that would not involve suffering. There was purpose in the subjugation of the Israelites. It had to happen. The redemption had to happen. And the question of, but if God is all good, how could God allow good people to suffer and for the Egyptians to get away with it for so long? It's almost like the Haggadah says, you can't ask that question. Your question doesn't make any sense. You're presuming that God stops all suffering or evil from taking place, right? But you wouldn't, you can't fault somebody for believing that, because eventually God does come down and redeem the people. So what's going on here? This question is wrestled with in the first midrash that's told about this verse. Let's read it together. We cried out unto the God of our fathers, as it is said, It was in the course of that protracted period that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed from the work and cried. So here are the important words. They sighed is not a great word. Groaned is better. Any of your Haggadah have groaned? Okay, they groaned from the hard work. Vayizaku, they screamed. Vata'al shavatam el Elohim min ha'avodah. Their plea arose to God from their plea from all of the work. What is this midrash trying to tell us? I think it's very important, this midrash, because it's trying to answer the question that I asked before. Either God just doesn't care about what happens in the world, and if God doesn't care about what happens in the world, then the question is what? Well, why did God come down in the end and save us? Obviously, God does care, so that doesn't make sense. Or God does care about what goes on in the world, and if God does care about what happens in the world, then why did it take him so long? In other words, what point does it do we have to get to for God to finally intervene? It's that second question that this midrash, I think, is answering. Things had to happen. The suffering had to reach a certain point in order for God to finally intervene. The answer that the midrash is providing helps us understand where that point is. At first, the suffering was provoking groans. Groans means, just noisy, wordless expressions of pain, right? Then the suffering becomes verbalized through, but it's not clear to whom or how. Vayizaku, they cried out, right? So from groaning to crying. But then something else happens. But then they turn to God with their plea. I think what the midrash is trying to say is, at a certain point in the suffering and the pain of Egypt, the people realized that they were helpless, that the Egyptians, this people whom they had once considered their friends, their protectors even, were not going to help them, right? And that they had no help in the world. Nobody was out for their best interests. And the only hope they had was that God would manifest somehow and save them. That's when they turned to God in prayer. That may not be a satisfying answer for you, right? But I'm here to, I acknowledge that. But let's understand the story that the Haggadah is trying to tell. Covenant, right, is what is about to be invoked in the next word. Take a look in the next verse. I'll show you, we'll skip ahead. Vayishma Hashem et koleinu. God heard our voice. As it is written, Vayishma Hashem et na'akatam. God heard their groans. Vayiskor Elohim et brito. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What is that magic moment when God decides to redeem the people? It is when the covenant is invoked. Who invokes the covenant first in the way the Haggadah tells the story? It's the people. It's Bnei Yisrael. through their suffering and pain, they turn to God. And remember that covenant means, hey, God promised us something. Where is he now that we need him? And then the next thing the Haggadah says is, when the covenant was invoked, when we remembered the covenant, Vayishma Hashem, God heard. Right? What is covenant in Judaism? It's a big word that we talk a lot about, but it is maybe the most fundamental theological concept in all of Judaism, right? Brit, covenant. What does it mean? We have several covenants in the Torah. This covenant that's being invoked now is a covenant of people, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The covenant that God makes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is what? You be my people, and I will be your God. It is a covenant that invokes land, right? That there's a land out there that invokes peoplehood, not yet a covenant that involves the Torah, which is important to remember, but it definitely involves a sense of obligation. We are obligated, and God is obligated too. Some people will interpret these verses and say, aha, the Jews started doing something that they weren't doing before. It's a troubling sort of explanation for those of us who believe that, so God is only listening when we're doing the right things, but when we're not doing the right things, he rejects us. I'm not sure I like that explanation. But something happens when we turn, Vayizaku el Hashem. When the groans and the screams, which were once, it seems, directed nowhere, ascend suddenly heavenward. And then God is reminded somehow that you have a people that you promised something to, and that it is time to act. I don't want to pretend that any of these answers are satisfactory, right? I just want to tell the story the way the Haggadah tells it. It was covenant that finally got God to act. That is the understanding that there was a promise that had to be fulfilled. That is consistent with the story the Haggadah tells, that God eventually was obligated to intervene because of a promise that was made. And by the way, I don't think it's any accident that the emphasis in the second midrash here is on the word Vayishma, as in God heard, Vayishma, with the exact language that we pray twice a day, right? The Shema is a very interesting prayer. Most prayers begin with, blessed are you, God, like we're talking to God. Who are we talking to in the Shema? Shema who? Shema Yisrael. Like it's a weird prayer, and many people say it's not a prayer. It is an affirmation. Shema is not a prayer to God as much as it is a directive to the people. Listen, Jews. The Lord is your God. The Lord is one. The Shema is the perfect prayer to encapsulate a covenantal relationship. Don't you agree? Because it's commanding our people to listen to the command that God has a special relationship with us and is one. That's why I think the theme is so similar. It's just impossible to miss it. When it says Vayishma Hashem, and it connects that to our cries out to God, I think it's a giant play on there were promises that needed to be fulfilled. Covenant means there's an obligation on our part, there's an obligation on God's part. We had to do something, and God had to do something. And whatever it was that we did, eventually God was obligated to respond. And even he listened to our directive, Shema, right? Listen to us, listen to our cries, maybe. All the verbs you see here are plural. Vayiz'aku, vaye'anfu. Everyone was crying together. And actually, many commentaries on the Haggadah will say that that shouldn't be missed also. That the people were not only crying for their own misery, but they were crying for each other's misery. The story of the Jewish people is a people whose nationhood was carved in suffering. There is something very important about that we miss. But that is, if you've grown up in the Jewish community, you understand how profound that narrative, that identity is. The fact that we are a people carved in suffering and in fact commanded never to forget that without that suffering, we wouldn't be who we are today. And not only that, but that suffering compels us to believe and act in certain ways towards the oppressed and our fellow in the world, right? Do not mistreat the stranger. Remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, right? The fact that that is our story and our narrative not only is something that shouldn't be taken for granted, but also presumes, in a way, what the Haggadah is doing, or the Haggadah's theology, which is, you have to go through this. This was all in God's plan. God was ready to make you a people, but couldn't make you a people until you had that experience of collective suffering. Because the Jewish people had to be a people of compassion, had to be a people of love, had to be a people that reached out to others in justice. Well, if you don't know what difficulty and challenge and oppression feels like, you're not going to be as effective as carrying forward that message, in carrying forward that message, right, of repairing the world and making it better. Are you with me at all? Does this make any sense? Mm-hmm. I think that no matter what you think about it, whether you're comfortable or uncomfortable with the idea, that is the story the Haggadah tells. God had a covenant. The covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not just involve salvation. It did involve a lot of bad stuff. God said, I'm not going to forsake you. I won't leave you down there in Egypt. The fourth generation will come and rise up again. But part of Jewish destiny is suffering. And you can't ask the question, why me? Because God was honest in the first place. Right? You want to be my chosen people, it's going to come at a cost. Right? A people that is called to do great things must also endure terrible things. And unfortunately, it's been our story. And Haggadah's very honest about that too. The Kol Dor Vador, right? In every generation they rise up to oppress us. But we're still here, right? Eventually God comes to it. Vayar et onyenu. That's the next piece. God saw our affliction. Before looking at the Midrash, what would you think affliction means? Vayar et onyenu means to start suffering, right? God saw that it sucked in Egypt, that we were doing backbreaking work. That's what onyenu means, our toil. But the Midrash looks at the word onyenu and sees the vowels or the letters ayin, nun, yud, which is often used in rabbinic and biblical Hebrew to imply sex, right? Ayin, nun, yud. La'anot can be to subjugate somebody or oppress them but there are sexual connotations there. So the Midrash picks up on this and says it wasn't the labor that God saw. It wasn't the toil that really made God respond. Remember, the fundamental question of this verse is, what is it that finally gets God to intervene? And it's not the work. It's rishut derech eretz. It's the disruption of marital relations. So this is an interesting answer to the question. Why do people have children? Selfish reason? I don't know. I think you can make a case that people don't have children for selfish reasons, as much as you can make a case that they do for selfish reasons. People have children, you would think, or I think in many cases, let's put it this way, in many cases, people have children because life is good, because they're hopeful, they're optimistic, they want to raise a family, there's peace, there's stability. Not in all cases, but for many, many people. You want to bring life into the world. You're happy to bring life into the world. When do you not have children? When life is difficult, when you can barely manage on your own. When do you not have children? When the situation is hopeless. And when you're worried about your child enduring or experiencing a world or a reality that is even worse than the one that you know. The Midrash says that it got that bad. This is a really good answer to the question of what causes God to finally intervene. Because even though the covenant says, even though God says in the covenant, you're going to have to go through some suffering in Egypt, the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You'll descend down to Egypt and you will suffer there. But it doesn't end there. The promise continues. You're going to go through a difficult time in Egypt, but eventually, I'm going to take you out of it. What is it that finally causes God to act? This is an interesting answer. Well, God saw that if he didn't act immediately, there would be no people to take out. There'd be nobody left. Because people had stopped having sex. People had stopped procreating. Zo prishut derech eretz. God saw that if he didn't act now, there would be nobody left to redeem. Kema shene'emar, vayar Elohim et bnei Yisrael, vayeda Elohim. God looked at the Jewish people and God knew. Vayeda. By the way, vayeda is also a word in the Bible that often has sexual connotations. To know somebody, right? So this is how the Midrash works. It looks at words and ideas and gets some deeper insight into the story that's being told. And this is actually a really good answer. God saw that if he didn't act now, it would be too late to wait around. So God, that's what finally got God to be motivated. The knowledge that people were not having children anymore and the time was running out. Okay, you with me? Deut Amalenu. God saw Amalenu. Amalenu means our frustrating burden is the translation that I have in my Haggadah. Another answer. What was it that finally got God to act? Habanim. Kol haben hayilod hayeora tashliku v'kol bat techayyu. Another possible answer to the question, what was it that finally got God to act? It wasn't the back-breaking labor. Either it was the fact that we started praying to God properly and invoking the covenant. Either it was the fact that people stopped having children, and if God didn't act now, there would be nobody left. And now another possible answer. When Pharaoh's cruelty developed or deepened, I don't know what it is, when Pharaoh's cruelty got so bad as to involve infanticide, take the boys and throw them into the river, it was a level of cruelty that finally got God to wake up. Right? Backbreaking labor, that's okay. But infanticide, children, dying and suffering without anyone to help them, that finally got God's attention. This is a really important statement about what is it that invokes human empathy. We're, as we watch this war take place in the Ukraine, there's a lot of talk right now about how far does Putin have to go to finally get the West to intervene in this crisis. So that discussion about how bad do things have to get for others, here we're talking about God, but you could take this discussion and very much adapt it to present circumstances and ask ourselves, well, how bad do things have to get before the world intervenes? Is it nuclear? Is it chemical warfare? Very often it is suffering children that lead people to want to act. That leads the world to wake up. If you remember a few years ago, there was a picture of a Syrian child, of the body of a Syrian baby washed up ashore somewhere from who was trying to, I think, run away with his family and must have drowned when he fell off the boat. But it was a picture that was on the cover of newspapers throughout the world. And I remember how that picture changed the whole narrative about whether or not Canada should intervene, should do more to help refugees from this war in Syria. And it's a little silly because you say to yourself, they were gassing children like weeks ago. We know what's going on. But there's something about seeing a suffering child that evokes dramatic empathy and awareness in people. So I think this is a very relatable discussion when you compare it to today's debates about intervention in the war in Eastern Europe, and also to this broader question about when we start feeling like we have to get involved. Is it really fair for us to scream at God when we're not even willing to get involved to save an innocent people? I mean, if we're not going to do it, and we have the ability to, we should maybe be careful about screaming at God for help. But the Haggadah, has these answers. And again, I'm not here to judge whether these answers are satisfactory to you. My guess is they're not entirely satisfactory. That's understandable and I think purposeful. But this is the discussion the Haggadah is trying to create. What is it that finally gets God to intervene? And even though the text itself at face value would seem to suggest over and over again, it was the fact that it was our labor, it was our slavery. Like it seems to be clear in the verse on Yenu, it was our toil, our slavery that awoke God's empathy, caused him to act. The Midrash doesn't like that. For the Midrash, that is not what provokes God's involvement, because it's just not bad enough. It had to get worse. Something had to happen at the moment when God decided to intervene that was not happening for the decades beforehand. It may have been prayer, it may have been the invocation of the covenant, it may have been the suffering of children, Pharaoh throwing the boys into the river, or it may have been the fact that people stopped having children. But something happened that awoke God's compassion. It also could have been lachatzenu, ve'et lachatzenu, our oppression. What is this is another answer to the question, why now? Why did God get involved now? Lachatzenu, oppression, is defined here in a particular way by the Midrash. Zeh ha-dechak. Zeh ha-dechak. How do your Haggadot translate the word dechak?
Persecution.
Persecution. What else? Do all of yours say persecution?
Crushing of our lungs.
Crushing of our lungs. Very good.
Lives.
Crushing of our lives. I like that better. Anyone? Any other Haggadah? Lidchok. Dochak. Right? Means heavy pressure. My Haggadah translates it, and it's not a bad translation, as density. It's not a great translation either, but I sort of like it. Interesting, this is opposite than the former claim, which was that people were not having children anymore, so you would expect a reduced population. But remember, this is the Haggadah entertaining, so what was it that finally got God to intervene? Another possible answer, again, it's not the labor, it's the dochak. It's the pressure of the population confined in small circumstances and basically unable to live. I think the only thing I can think of when I'm reading this is ghettos. Right? What caused God to finally intervene? The Jews being rounded up, trapped in small circumstances, and that didn't happen until the very end. So again, it's consistent with this notion that the slavery itself and the backbreaking work itself was not the problem. Things had to just get particularly bad for God to intervene. And these are all ideas of what it was that got particularly bad. I think this is a general comment about conditions, the conditions of their lives got so bad that God finally intervenes. Yes.
This one has a slightly different take on
Go
it.
ahead, yeah. A
That the
slightly
men
different
had
take,
to
yeah.
lodge in the field, and the women in the city, in order to contain their fruitfulness. But the women came to their husbands with food and drink.
So your Haggadah talks about separating people. I don't mind that. I think that it all falls under this general, this midrash is talking about living conditions.
But what it says is on
Yes.
the merits of the women, because the women were so righteous and brought to their husbands and consoled them, that's why Israel was.
That's another midrash that talks about the power of women in reminding God of, compassion and kindness towards another, and women personify that, and so that but that's not in, that's not here. It's nice, I like it a lot, but it's not the midrash that is being told. It just says very simply, Zeh hadchak, kemo shenemar, gam ra'iti et halachatz asher Mitzrayim lochatzim otam. I see how the Egyptians are oppressing them. I don't mind that midrash because it's saying, look, conditions got so bad, but you have a different definition of what those conditions were than I do, which is fine. It all makes the same point. God was not there to stop heavy labor, but God was there to stop suffering that got to the point of no return. Almost. There was a certain point in the suffering that got so bad, and that's when finally God said, I can't let this continue. You had a question, Mom?
No, I guess it's really about study. But the Haggadah was written over a generation.
Yes.
Don't you think that whenever this part was written, and what the circumstances of that society, the local,
Yes.
but also.
So Merle's question is, just for the benefit of those on live stream, do some of these midrashim represent contemporary, whenever they're not talking about the Exodus from Egypt, they're really just referencing the Exodus from Egypt in order to understand their circumstances today. I think that's an excellent point. Very, very plausible, and sometimes it's actually, this next verse, it'll become really clear. Sometimes it's obvious that these midrashim may be very old, keep in mind. They're ancient midrashim, many of them. But they're being chosen for a reason. Some are chosen remember we went over this, some are chosen in Palestine and not in Babylonia. The Babylonian Haggadah doesn't contain it, but the Palestinian one does. If you remember, Anus al Pi HaDibur, the midrash on the first verse of the 4. Why did Jacob go down to Egypt? Who gave him the right to leave? And the midrash answers, he was forced. Who chose that midrash? Right? Clearly, somebody living in Israel who doesn't want people to leave Israel for a better lifestyle in New York. And so he writes, don't you think that you can do the same thing? Jacob had permission from God. You don't. So they're always, all of these midrashim will have an ounce of it, at least an ounce of it, of contemporary resonance to those who included this passage in the Haggadah in a formal way. Some much more than an ounce. So some it's just a little bit, some it's huge. So certainly passages like these invoke questions and moments in Jewish history, moments of suffering and anguish where these same questions were asked, right? And it is it's a plausible reaction to the suffering of a current circumstance to say, well, God is still here for us. God is still watching. God is still feeling our pain. God does allow suffering to manifest in the world, but not infinitely. There is a point where God acts.
the midrash that Marcia quoted,
Yeah,
I would take that to be a very modern midrash, and I think it's an attempt by the person using it to write women back into the text.
yeah, no, it could very well be Marcy's midrash that she quoted in the New American Haggadah. It could be an effort to write women back in the text. I'm with you. And many people do that in many ways in their Seder, and there's a place for that. I just don't see it in the original text
So when it used,
of the Haggadah.
like music talks about, because it used the fact that these were to like be together, that they were better wives.
Yes,
And
yeah.
It used the sexual aspect too, because it's.
Absolutely. Even though it's not there in the original version of the Haggadah, it hooks on to this idea that living conditions descending to a certain level and creating and manifesting something else among the people, it got God involved, woke God up. And here it was the women getting involved. So now we're on the last verse of the 4. ויוציאנו השם ממצרים ביד חזקה ובזרוע נטויה ובמורא גדול ובאותות ובמופתים. This verse no longer concerns itself with the question of what was it that finally got God to intervene, and instead will address how the redemption happened. So God now redeems the people with signs and wonders. Let's now look word by word to see what is going on here. What is the deeper story that the verses are trying to tell? Vayotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim. Let's start with the first 3 words. Not via an angel, not via a seraph, not via an agent, rather the Holy One, blessed be He in His unique glory, as it is written, I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from human to animal, and upon all the gods I will execute judgment. I, God. What is going on here? Vayotzienu Hashem. God brings us out of Egypt. This midrash is answering a question. We don't know the question, but we know the answer. The answer is only God, no messenger, no angel, only God, only God, only God. What's going on here? If that's the answer, then what is the question that the midrash is addressing? This is clearly a polemic. It's answering somebody. We know that because it starts with no, lo al yedei shaliach, don't think it was any other way. Who is it a polemic against? Well, the first thing you see in this is your first reaction to this verse was, well, didn't Moses do something? I mean, shaliach, a messenger. Okay, we understand there was no other angel involved, but God did use human ability to make this whole thing play out. This is pretty insulting against Moses. Why isn't Moses there? So this could be a polemic against those who believe that Moses should get a bigger role in the Haggadah. We should be talking more about the role Moses played. And maybe those who believe that Moses was almost a semi-divine figure. It could be. I think that what troubles me about that explanation is that we don't really have a lot of evidence that there were people out there who worshipped Moses. However, we do have evidence that there's a whole religion out there of people who believe that redemption, right? Redemption can only be received through semi-divine or divine figure other than God with the initials JC. Okay? So I'm one of those who thinks that this is so, clear that you have to be blind in order to miss that this is an anti-Christian polemic. And that Moses got caught up in the mix. But you feel bad for Moses, because Moses does deserve some mention, you think, in the Haggadah. He played a role, at least Moses, but probably Aaron too, probably Miriam also. They don't end up in the Haggadah because the story is told, as I said, through the verses in Deuteronomy and not through the verses in Exodus. But you would hope that Moses just gets some honorable mention somewhere, but he doesn't. And I think it's because the Haggadah is responding to the same holiday that is occurring in the homes of its Christian neighbors at around the same time of year, that had reinterpreted the events of the Exodus to be about a person. In the rabbinic view, it is about a person, a messenger, an angel, a seraph, whatever you call it. It's not about God. And I think this is an answer to anyone who would charge that there is an alternate power besides God that is responsible for or capable of affecting redemption in the world, right? So it's a very interesting passage because I think it makes us aware of the fact, and this gets back to your comment, Merle, about, well, why were these midrashim chosen in the first place? Well, there was no Christians around during the time of the Exodus, and very few around in the times of the early rabbinic period. So these midrashim are being included in the later rabbinic period when Christianity is more prominent and when the Jews are more aware of Christian theology and how Christian theology interprets the Bible and the story of the Exodus specifically. And here it answers that. It's a response, it's a polemic. Do not feel that anyone else except for God is responsible for the Exodus from Egypt. That's, I think, the first thing we have to say about this passage. But there's something else that I think is important here also. The events of the Exodus are violent. They involve suffering, they involve bloodshed, people die, right? Remember how I said just a few moments ago, it is extremely important in the story that we tell about the Jewish people, that the story be focused on people that endured suffering and hardship in order to get a compassionate heart that can associate, relate to the suffering of others. That is necessary in order to bring about the redemption of the world. The Jews would never be able to be effective in redeeming the world unless their story had involved in it, not just once, but numerous times, oppression and the feeling of victimhood, etc., etc. Maybe what the Haggadah, and I think it's more than maybe, I think it's likely the Haggadah is saying, God did this to the Egyptian people. You did it. So let me repeat that again. God is responsible for the plagues and the suffering of the Egyptian people. Do not absorb the qualities that you think led to your liberation in order that you then become a people that believes in warfare and violence and the oppression of others in order to sustain your religion. in order to sustain your identity. Are you with me on this? The point is that revenge and violence were taken by God, not by human hands. When the Midrash is saying, Ani v'lo mal'ah, okay, on one hand, we could say maybe it's an answer to the Christians. Let's leave that aside for a second. I think the message also is not you, not an shaliyah. I didn't want you to have to destroy the Egyptian people, because then you would have become a war-like people. And Judaism is a religion of peace and tolerance and love. God has the right to effect violence against others, but you be very careful in understanding that you had nothing to do with this. And especially I think because the Exodus from Egypt is the formative event in in the creation of the Jewish nation. This is where we talked about that in the early days of this class, right? Exodus 12. Actually, it's Shabbat HaChodesh this week. So this coming Shabbat, we're going to read Exodus 12, the formation of the Jewish peoplehood, which begins with the Jewish calendar, right? The story of how we became a people is not the story of the Jews overtaking their enemies, wreaking vengeance upon them, and being victorious. We miss that because we're familiar with the story, but I think it's just beautiful that the Haggadah reminds us that that is not our story. And the fact that that's not our story has shaped Judaism still today. And I think, I'm not an expert on Islam, but many people far smarter than me have commented that Islam today still wrestles with the fact that its formative years as a religion involved tremendous violence and bloodshed, right? I'm not saying, I'm not accusing Islam of anything. I'm just putting it in those terms, right? Remember that Islam began with Muhammad, who was a warlord, and people were beheaded for not converting to Islam, including many Jews, right? The fact that Islam began with so much violence is still a challenge today, because it would seem to justify ongoing religious violence for the sake of their own religious well-being, right? We are allowed to subjugate others and to force conversion upon them and even to be violent against them, because that's how we started out as a people. And if it was okay for Muhammad, it's okay for us, right? And look at how we tell the totally opposite story. It is true that there's violence at the beginning of our national formation, but it was God, not you, and you have no right to do what God did, right? Vengeance and revenge, that's God's business, not yours. I don't know if you ever thought of that before. It's a very profound message of the Haggadah. Let's keep going. We're now beyond Chazakah. Do you see that? Zohadever. The mighty hand is pestilence, the plague of pestilence, which is the plague that affected the animals. And then the next midrash is Bizroa Netuyah. This is the sword. Zohacherev. So let's spend just some time on trying to understand this. Okay, so we're talking about the plagues of Egypt. We begin with the statement that everything was done by God and not by anybody else. what would you expect the next part to be? It should start with blood, frogs. Okay, let's go through the list of them, but we're skipping ahead. We get to Deut, the cattle plague, and the sword, which we don't even know where that is. The Torah doesn't talk about a sword being used in any of the plagues of Egypt. So let's ask ourselves what's going on. Why is the Midrash associating God's mighty hand and outstretched arm with the cattle plague and the Dever and the sword? Let's address the first question. I think it's important to remember that animals play a large role in the Exodus story. We're going to read about that this Shabbat HaChodesh. Before the final plague occurs, what's the first thing we have to do? We have to go get a lamb, remember, and bring it into our house on the 10th day of the month, and get slaughtered on the 14th day of the month. And then the Pesach sacrifice that gets offered for, in the temple is also an animal. Animals play a huge role in the story of the Exodus, and some say it's because the Egyptians worshipped animals and believed that they depicted Egyptian gods. So if you look at some of the hieroglyphics, and if you've been to a museum to try and see to try and learn something about Egyptian culture and religion, you'll see that many of their gods were like half animals or all animals. Anubis and Osiris and all their gods had animal properties over them. So if we understand Egyptian religion as believing that the animal kingdom had divine properties to it, perhaps that's the reason why the plague of cattle pestilence or Deut plays such a prominent role, because it represents God's defeat over the Egyptian animal kingdom, which they worshipped. And even though that's something we can't relate to, it really does become a feature of the Passover Seder. The Exodus is commemorated with the slaughtering of a lamb. Right? So we say the lamb is not God. And God uses the animals as tools for salvation, but they are not God themselves. That's one explanation, but it's not my favorite. I have a preferred explanation for the plague of Deut, why it is highlighted. There are 10 plagues. But other than the plague of the firstborn, and I'm not even clear that the plague of the firstborn was invisible, because the Torah might say that it says God traveled through the streets of Egypt, and that could even be physically manifested. In the movie, The Ten Commandments, you can see the smoke. I don't know if that's actually what it looked like, but it could be that you could see the plague of the firstborn actually happen. But other than that one, this is the only invisible plague of the 10. Blood you can see, frogs you can see, lice you can see, light you can see, darkness you can see, but pestilence, it's like coronavirus. You can't see it. And if the point of Deut is to show, remember, all of this is to show God's superiority over the world, the message that's being sent with this particular plague, with none other, is a message that's very profound in Judaism. the message that the things that we can't see are often much more powerful and real than the things that we can. The Egyptian religion was incredibly materialistic. They believed in burying people with a bunch of gold stuff. That is, their worship of the material even met the point of ridiculous. For them, the only things that mattered were the tangible, the ephemeral. Think of how different Judaism is in that regard. We're saying that this God that you cannot see is more powerful than all of your objects, all of your stuff, all of your animals that you worship, the gold that you collect, the wheat that you store in your storage houses. I like that explanation for why Dever is highlighted. It is the only invisible plague and was chosen to be highlighted here in a section that emphasizes God's redemption. It is God's redemption over the spiritual, over the material. And then the sword. So the sword here is chosen by the Midrash, right? As it quotes a verse from where? Is it Ezekiel? Find it. Chronicles. Divrei Hayamim. V'charbo shlufa v'yado netuya al Yerushalayim. His sword drawn in his hand, stretched out over Jerusalem. I'm pretty sure this is a verse talking about David's conquest of Jerusalem with his sword. So the conquest of Jerusalem with the sword is compared to God's conquest over Egypt with an outstretched arm. God is engaged in a siege, in a battle campaign. And even though the plagues are not quoted, the sword is used to give God a sort of military, since the sword is the primary weapon used by an army, gives God a military identity. Why is that important? I said something important before, or I think was important, about the violence of Egypt being given to God and not to people, right? Vengeance was taken by God, ani velo malach, God and not a messenger or an angel. Eventually, when the Israelites arrive at the sea, God becomes, and we say this in our prayers every morning, Adonai ish milchama. God has become a warrior. Right? The process that God embarks on to liberate the Egyptians is depicted as a war, not waged by the people, but waged by God. As much as Judaism might be a religion, as I said, of peace and tolerance and love and understanding, etc., etc., I think there's an important message here about the limits of peace and love and tolerance and understanding. Maybe we have this comment, God and not the people, to say, be very careful assimilating the attributes of bloodshed and violence into your national identity. But also be aware that sometimes, in order for there to be progress, in order for there to be redemption, in order to make the world a better place, You need a sword. You need force. God did not negotiate with Pharaoh. That's not how liberation was achieved. It took raw plagues. Sometimes we turn the plagues at our Seder into like playthings. And Dam, Spardeya, Kinim, it's all like a joke. There's silly events that happen in the world. That is not the way the Haggadah looks at the plagues. The plagues are not funny, according to the Haggadah. They are God wreaking powerful, violent vengeance on the Egyptians for their mistreatment of the Jews. They're horrifying, right? Ultimately leading to the death of the firstborn. As much as we are afraid of the power of these plagues, and we're going to get to this, but that's why we spill the wine from our cups at these Seders. We'll get there next week. But that spilling of the wine, which we're about to do, we're about to get there in the Haggadah, which is about being afraid of the power of these plagues. We recognize that sometimes they are necessary in order to move forward. This is I've said it a million times, may as well say it 1,000,001 times. Haggadah deals with every subject you could possibly imagine. I hope you've seen that by now. We've had such interesting discussions about all the different themes that the Haggadah brings up. This is another one. Sometimes the only thing that can defeat evil is brute force. That's what a sword is. The sword represents God as an agent of war. And as much as that is something that we need to be afraid of, it is also something that we have to be comfortable with. If bad people get away with doing bad things, right, the world will just keep descending into eternal violence and chaos. This is a major scolding of what you might call today isolationism. What is isolationism? Isolationism is basically, unless you're coming to kill me, unless you're coming to, you're on your own. Right? What they call in America, America first. This is in my mind a major scolding of America first, of isolationism, of the idea that unless you are being attacked personally, you should just sit back and watch. God is not only on the side of the victim, we already established that, but God condones the use of force. Violence, while we're afraid of it, and particularly it's are absorbing that quality of bloodthirstiness, we are not a non-violent religion. We're not a religion that believes that violence is always wrong and that violence should never be used in any circumstance. There are times when it should be used. And again, the contemporary discussions about how the world needs to defend people who are right now living under oppression. This, I think, is very, very de jour. Don't you agree? Right? How did World War II end? In Japan, at least. Didn't end until the West decided we need to just use violence, a dramatic wave of violence to put an end to this. I am not, be careful with those of you online. I'm not inviting email criticisms about history, and I'm not making a judgment about the use of nuclear weapons to end wars. All I'm saying is, if you wanted to make a case that sometimes brute violence is necessary in order for there to be progress, this is what you would want to use. God's usage of the sword in bringing about redemption is not looked at by the Haggadah as being improper or futile or unjust. It is seen as being part of who God is. God is a warrior who fights on the side of justice and condones the use of force in certain circumstances for progress to be made, for there to be progress. Okay. Comments, questions? Heavy, yes, it is a heavy topic, but if it's going to be a book that's going to last the centuries, it can't treat people too fragile. It has to address the big questions, right? So it dances the Haggadah on this theme of violence, right? Can you see that already in the way it's telling the story? When we get to the spilling of the wine, you'll see the spilling of the wine says, we're afraid of God's power. I'll skip ahead to next week for just a moment. We all think the spilling of the wine is because of what? Our cup is diminished, because our joy is diminished at the downfall of our enemies. Jews don't celebrate at the downfall of our enemies, so we reduce the wine when we say the Ten Plagues. I'm sure you've seen that. That's probably in Marcy and your Haggadah, I'm guessing. That is, that's very nice, and it is a real thought, but it's not the original origin. It's not the origin of that custom. The origin of the custom is because that wine, the plagues, when we say the plagues, we're afraid of them. They are fearful. The fact that God has such power makes us intimidated. We don't want to see that power even used against our enemies because it's too strong. And we're spilling out the wine to reduce their power, to say we don't want these to return. So it's this dance that the Haggadah plays, on this theme, saying violence is sometimes necessary, but ought to be as they say, measure of last resort. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Complicated? How so?
Thank you. Great lecture.
Really great.
Yeah,
Thank you, Rabbi.
yes.
Yeah.
So what I say is the tensions that are being produced with these midrashim and the fact that they are left unanswered, that's what makes your Seder so interesting. If all of this was tied up neatly with answers that were concise and clear, we'd have nothing to talk about. We'd get together and say, yeah, no, this is all very logical. Instead, the Haggadah says, you can see things this way, you can see things that way. Here's one possible answer, but here's another one. Here are questions that we're going to just give you a taste of, but we're not going to satisfy you with our answers. That's what makes the Seders interesting. And by the way, what makes them relevant in no matter what circumstances are going around. Yes.
Dr. Baker said that, that Moses wasn't given his
He wasn't given his due.
But you know what, I saw this little movie, this little book about some different stars.
Yes.
And I mean, the bottom, I think reality, I mean, how many thousands of Israelites left Egypt?
Yes,
It wasn't only Moses, I mean, Israel was like, one person gets up and dances on the beach. It's actually apropos of whatever,
Yeah.
moving on. And then another person gets up to join another person, and then you have this movement. And I
Right.
think that's
so you're saying
actually
maybe the Haggadah does not want to highlight Moses because it takes away the message of the collective
it has to
being
be-
accountable for its destiny.
Yeah, it
And
has
we can so easily say, well, we don't have a Moses in this generation, so let's just,
or
we
the
have
fact
nothing we
that
can do.
Moses needed
very good. I like that a lot. I like that a lot.
Walk up.
I like that a lot, right?
One of
We
the-
shouldn't, Moses doesn't get his due because the Haggadah, again, is not a story of history. If we talk about Moses, this becomes a historical story. Instead, let's talk about the people. And then it becomes an eternal story. Then it remains relevant today.
One of the immigration was about how God saw how the Jews were compassionate to one another and helped one another when they were suffering.
Yes, that is about so the fact that the verbs are in plural, they cried out, may mean they cried out for each other's pain, but not just because of their own pain.
The other thing that kept reminding me of is when we were in Greece.
Yeah.
And they talked about how in World War II, the Nazis got bogged down in Bulgaria.
Yes,
And because of that, they didn't get to Russia. So that's why they got bogged down in the winter. Their plan was that they'd have everything all conquered.
yes.
I've always wondered if that wasn't God's plan in somewhere.
Right, maybe in some, we can't answer those questions for sure, but what you're saying is maybe we see, circumstances and coincidences in the world that are really God's hand directing the affairs.
Okay,
thanks, everyone.
Yeah, that was very.
Thank you, Rabbi.